Thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and thank you so much to our speakers. It is my great pleasure to be able to open up the conversation with a couple questions, but before I do that, I do want to say thank you so much to the Stowe Center for hosting, and I just want to have a little shout out to Oliver Scholes over there, who was a graduate student with us at University of Connecticut, and I can say he's a humble man, but I can say with absolute assurance, absolutely one of the best students that I ever worked with as a graduate student. And to also thank Richard, who Richard's coming to the Humanities Institute was an extremely important moment for us in the sense that he is the first non-academic fellow that we've had at what up to that point was an academics-only space. And he's done absolutely extraordinary work to bring the work that people do on Horse Barn Hill or at other places around the state out into the communities that we serve and the communities that support us. UConn, of course, being a public institution with a great responsibility to the community. So thanks, Richard. All right. Now, with that said, let's get cracking on this. So it does sort of seem interesting, right, to talk about the question of humility. How do we define it? And think about civility. It seems to be something that is in short order as we look about the political and cultural landscape of America at the moment. And so we have four tremendous voices here with us this evening. And just to kick off the conversation, we just simply want to ask them to respond to what is the kind of gathering statement for this event, right? How do you balance humility and your conviction and express yourself with civility in trying to talk across difference, right? And dealing with the complex questions that face every community. And so this is not an academic question, right? This is a question that is a lived reality for all of us. And so let's just start there. What does humility mean to you? What does acting civilly mean to you? And what do you think the connections are between the two of them and a meaningful public discourse? And I don't really want to call anybody out, but I might just look for hey, person to my right.
The person who said, don't call on me? Well, hi everybody. Nice to see you here tonight. Wouldn't it be funny if we started yelling at each other? I think this is true not just for public discourse or political discourse, but it's true in probably everything that we do in life. And I teach a class on Thursdays at Charter Cultural Center, and we were just talking about this today, actually. I think the way to live a humane life is to always be going inside ourselves. So that we were actually reading today an article, it was an interview that appeared in the New York Times with Jay-Z. And he was asked the question, do you, even though you're rich and you're famous, do you experience racism? And of course his answer was yes. And the question was, well, how do you deal with it? And he said, I've been in therapy. And so I realized that when someone is racist, that's about them. And he said, and then when someone confronts me with some racist energy or epithets or whatever it is, I can go inside and I can find compassion. And then what I say to myself is, that person is acting out from that place because they're wounded. And he said, and then I can say, hey man, you must be in a lot of pain. So I think going inside and being separate and looking at our own reactions to things and what's going on inside of us, having compassion for ourselves leads to compassion for other people and a kind of a larger universe, so that it's not just that person's statement, it's not just that person's politics. That's a wave in the ocean, but an awareness that there is a bigger ocean, there's a bigger story. And I think that really helps as we talk about very difficult things in a very, very difficult time.
Thanks so much. Perhaps I'll move to my left.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Beecher Stowe, for this enriched, tons of respect for you and what you're doing. So thank you for including me. The question is a difficult question to answer in the sense that every single day you're challenged with a decision. Every single moment that you walk out of your home, You park your car, you go into the office to work, you get a phone call, you name it. You're confronted with a sudden decision to react to that based on the energy you're receiving. And I'm an energy person. I believe in the energy in the room. And for me, when I think about being civil, and I think about the courtesy that you extend to someone else, I think about how instances where that wasn't shared led to someone's death or someone's demise or someone's incarceration. For me, is a deep issue, because I think that every single step and every action that I take can have lasting effects on my community. And as someone who came from a very violent background, the proudest you could be is when you found yourself responding to something with aggression. So for me, learning the absolute practice of being civil and being cordial to other people have made me more human and more accepting of myself and more accepting of my challenges. When I think about humility, I just think about how I make people feel. Because we can sit here today and say many things, but it's how you leave people, how you make people feel, how people walk away from you based on what you've done and what you've said, that will determine what kind of energy you get back in return. So for me, this is a very personal kind of mission that I'm on, to be as kind as I can to folks. So I'll give a quick story today that it just dawned on me. I received a call from a stranger who saw a Fox 61 episode last night. And the person called me, and halfway into the conversation, they dropped a swear word about kids. You know, these kids doing these whatever. And I was surprised because I'd never spoken to this person in my entire life. But they found it very comfortable and comforting to swear about kids that they were having trouble with in their community to me over the phone. And my response was just to listen and then offer something comforting, while still feeling inside that it was unfair for someone to call me and judge young people who were behaving badly the way she was. And although I felt bad for how the young people were being defined, I also felt bad for the lack of understanding that they may have had of what possessed a young person to do what she said they did. So for me, I walked away from that looking at myself and saying, how would I feel if I was her? And what can I do to comfort her, while at the same time validate the fact that she is probably afraid of what she doesn't understand. So for me, humility leads to that. Civility is really just about being able to look someone in the eyes and feel comfortable that you're treating them with the same respect that you want for yourself. If you want to go left or right or left. I'll pick on her because she came from Massachusetts. So we have the Boston Red Sox and Yankees going at it right now.
Don't say Connecticut TV. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for making the way out here, and thank you so much, Richard, and my wonderful colleagues for including me here. And thank you to the Beecher Stowe House and the colleagues here. So this has all been very interesting because it resonates with me for many reasons. And maybe I can give a little background. I mainly come to intellectual humility through intercultural competence. And as part of my research and part of my outreach to schools, I do work in order to develop the skills of intellectual humility and intercultural competence, and I look at the implications. So what does intellectual humility have to do with intercultural competence, and the other way around? And we find a lot of similarities. So I look at intellectual humility from a research point of view. So unfortunately, I do have to bring that in a little bit. And I look at the more intellectual part of it. So really owning the limitations of one's knowledge, knowing what you know, knowing what you don't know, and how, in terms of education, how do we get students to develop those skills, to figure out how they can get good information, how they can evaluate information, know what they know what they don't know. Intellectual humility also has to do with generosity in a way. Generosity in the sense that I know what I know, but I know what you know and what you bring to the table. And I want to hear what you have to bring to the table. So it has to do with listening, with open-mindedness, and with that generosity. Also giving praise where praise is concerned and not owning somebody else's knowledge and contribution, right? So there are many aspects that have to do with intellectual humility. I do think that from various corners of research, there are a lot of practical skills that we actually can teach, skills, knowledge, attitudes that have to do with these concepts. Not to make it too long, but I also think in terms of civility, civility sometimes is mistaken as only politeness. Mm-hmm. And I want to warn against that, because then we might miss a part that has to do with being part of a community and still contributing and being able to talk about difference. If I'm only polite, I might shy away from talking about difference and saying, I disagree with you, and really have deep conversations. And that might actually hinder us from making relationships and really growing as a community. So for me, civility has to do with politeness, but I'm also asking, who makes those rules of conduct? Do we exclude people with our rules of conduct? So it's a complex issue. I'm sorry for opening a can of worms. I think it's extremely useful, but also complex.
And so, I must confess there have been times in my life where I was not very humble. Certainly there have been times where I was neither civil nor polite, defined as one will. And we live in a world that does not celebrate humility, and yet we are called to be humble, we're called to be civil, and we hear things bounced off the walls about being politically correct, which absolutely boils my skin, in that there's a way to be, my wife often has said, as we are raising our children, you know, you're being brutally honest, and there's nothing wrong with being lovingly honest. And lovingly honest tells the same thing, but it does it in a way where people are willing to listen, that they are not attacked, but recognize that there's a truth that might be needed at that time. We do live in a world that is harsh and right now not very civil. And the most difficult journey we take is that journey within, because therein we may find those things that repulse us, that we are unwilling to find, that's broken. And yet that journey is the place that we must go in order to be able to communicate with others, to be comfortable with ourselves, to essentially have custody of our egos. And the moment that you have a custody of your own ego, you're able to allow others, to be who they are and not judge them harshly, because let's be honest, we're going to judge one another. It's in our DNA. It is how we are as human beings. But it is to do it in a way that does not diminish, demean, nor hurt others, but to see where they are, love where they are, recognize who they are is an extraordinary thing. Imagine here all of the experiences every single one of us has. Every human being in here has an experience from which we could be better. We can know more. We can live better. We can experience things that we may never experience with our own lifetime. So it is vitally important to be able to be humble enough to know that you don't know, to recognize that others have these incredible experiences through their eyes. My last thing, I've learned never to say I understand someone else. And the reason I do, and I've learned that, is because my wife and I have 4 children. And with our children, during the pregnancy, I was there. I went to every Lamont class there was. When there was morning sickness, I had a washcloth, and I was standing there, and I just was everything I could possibly do. At 2 o'clock in the morning, when she awoke and some kind of strange thing she wanted, I'd go out and get it. And when the babies were born, I was there, breathing as best I could, helping her as best I could. But if I ever told her I understood what it meant to be pregnant, you see, I can't. But I can bear witness. And I think we are all called to bear witness to one another's pain, one another's joy. And the best way to do that is not to stop being who we are, but to be able to see who they are, because it does not invade our personhood. So.
Wow. Great opening statements. Wow. But I was jotting down.
There's more?
I was jotting down notes. I was jotting down notes and saying, let me toss my questions. I got new questions. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to start off with a couple of questions that we will sort of go back and forth with the panelists with, and then we'll open it up to a conversation. So we spent a lot of time going back and forth with these questions. So hopefully these will be good ones. Your comments about intellectual humility really struck a chord with me. I've always thought to myself, and someone told me a very long time ago, got phone.
We don't understand
But someone told me a very long time ago, the problem is not what we don't know, it's what we often think we know that really gets us into trouble. And so this is a question, I guess, that brings to mind the internet and the role that the internet is playing now, and I think in our public discourse and some of our incivility and lack of humility. So in the age of the internet, we all seem to believe that we are one Google search, Wikipedia page, or a favorite blogger's post away from being an expert on any subject. Research also shows that social media debates have actually ruined friendships. One might argue that the internet and our social media and news bubbles have fueled a belief that we have no reason to alter our thoughts about anything because everyone has a right to their own opinion. And everyone's opinion about anything is as good as anyone else's. The internet and social media will not disappear anytime soon, though I'm proud to say I've actually checked out of social media. So how do we become more humble and civil online?
Well, for me, I find it very easy because I don't think that the internet is my platform to change who I am inside. So every single character that I type, every single sentence that I write, every video I record must be with the same passion that I would deal with a person in reality, face to face. And although it can be received in many different ways based on the interpretation of anyone that's reading it, my commitment and my desire and the intention for why I wrote the things is still the same. It's about communicating a message of hope and peace to people who may need to hear it. So for me, I've never had a conversation or disagreement with anyone over Facebook or any social media, and I don't know if I can claim this today, but I'm probably on more social media sites than the general public is, because I'm pretty much on everything. And it's part of my platform for communicating the messages of peace. And as a, some of you may or may not know, but as a former gang member of 17 years, I received death threats over the internet from states far away. And the way I respond to that is, thank you for sharing your opinion. I wish you peace. I wish you well. And they get mad, oh, you should shut up. I can't wait to see you in my neighborhood. If you ever come to this state, I'll get this or that. And the same thing I say is, I don't understand how may I have hurt you. I apologize. And again, I wish you and your family well. It doesn't have any kind of reaction in my soul, because that, to me, is countering what I stand for. So for me, when you talk about discourse over online, I just think it's not the right time for me to go back and forth with someone. If I want to have an honest conversation with someone, then I invite them to have one. And I think that's how I handle that on that social media.
I'm older, So I'm on Facebook because that's where old people go. I don't know Instagram but I don't even know the name. But the way that I do work with schools, and I recognize that schools, particularly young people, have these platforms by which they do demean one another and hurt one another and bully one another. But it is not necessarily the social media that does it. It is, in fact, our society that fosters it. Many of you know I grew up with him at Till. And when I go to schools, I talk about that he was not murdered because of anything he did. He was murdered because of who that community was. And that community allowed and fostered hatred. The community allowed it to happen. The community supported those who did the murdering. So that society needed to be changed. In order for social media to right itself, our very society has to become a beloved community. And once it becomes a beloved community, then those kinds of symptoms won't exist because they don't in a beloved community. We all have heard that old proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. And it's true. The problem is our village is sick. And we're raising sick children in an uncivil environment. So if we are to do something, it is to help heal our communities so that the children within our communities and our very selves will be better. And we do it one person at a time. We do it with the work that Iran does and that Rabbi does and that Maduela does. It is, and every single one of you. I did a retreat once because I'm a clergy, and a little old lady, about 84 years old, came up to me and said, "What are we going to do about ISIS?" And what went through my mind is a little old lady with an AR-15 out fighting in the jungle. And my response was, love someone right now wherever you are. Wherever you go, love somebody at the grocery store. If somebody has 17 items in the 15-item line, don't get angry with them. Just love every second and every human being you do, because the only way to counter any kind of hatred is to love where you are. Besides that, that's the only thing you can do. And indeed, it's the most important.
I am not on social media at all. At my age, I don't do Facebook, I do facelift, but. Okay, you laughed a little too much on that. But if you go back to what we were talking about before in terms of going inside yourself, I think the orientation of social media is the opposite. And I think that might be one of the issues. It's not a forum that encourages or inspires introspection. It's all about kind of looking outward. And I think that we live in a society that is very much into blame and very much into punishment. And that is always about looking outside, not about looking inside. If you look inside, I'm telling you, I think this is like the whole ball of wax. If you look inside and you're looking at yourself all the time, you just come from a different place. You're not as prone to blame. You're not as prone to being punishing or judgmental, because you're dealing always with your own wounded places and your own unfinished places. So I'm very afraid of social media because I think that it is Big Brother. I think that it looks a little different because it's not the government technically looking at us, but we're looking at each other. And I also think that in this particular political environment, it's probably pretty dangerous. To me, that's how it feels. So I stay away. But I have to say, you inspired me with the idea of sending out messages of peace and love and the energy of peace and love. I think that is worthwhile, and I might go on Facebook tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is so interesting, and I don't even know where to start, so I try to say a few things. And so I like the idea of going inside, and maybe the way I approach it in education is to decenter, to really teach students to take a step back, and maybe especially when they feel triggered by something, when they feel their identity is hurt and all they want to say is I disagree. So whenever they want to say I disagree, we teach to ask questions and really say, this is interesting, so, and then ask questions, probing questions, so that you find out more. And most likely, you will find yourself disagree less. Or you might find yourself with more ground for disagreeing, right? Either way is good. The other thing is in terms of intellectual humility online. If you come at it with an attitude of curiosity and open-mindedness, right? Again, you can use the many sources that are out there for good. So I have hope. I see when a catastrophe happens, people coming together online. And what we can do in education, I believe, is to help students have a goal other than self-promotion online. Have the goal of coming together as a community, doing something, solving a problem. And solving a problem really includes intellectual humility, because we need to know something about the problem, the different perspectives, before we can solve a problem. So I think there are really, again, many strategies that we can teach and that we can use ourselves to use the internet for the good. And finally, just one last statement. I think there's always this struggle, especially on the internet, between the private and the public sphere. And students often think, even though they go out onto the internet, that something is private when it is very public. And I think that's another aspect in education that we need to deal with very carefully. What does it mean when we put something online?
Thank you very much. So it's very interesting listening to the responses to Bilal's question, and how many of the responses spoke to the internal, going inside, and which is interesting as a reaction to a question which is really about this public-facing discourse. And so I want to kind of push on that particular issue and think beyond the individual and think beyond, say, social media, or the internet as a platform for individual expression, and think about that kind of mediating space between the individual and the community, which is the institution, right? And all of us can think about how we individually might practice humility, model civility in the world, but all four people here are connected to wonderful, inspiring, interesting institutions, but we know that institutions, or I guess this is a question, can institutions also be arrogant, uncivil, problematic? And if so, and institutions, however we wish to define these, are on the one hand the bedrock of our civil society. They are also in many ways the bedrock of our economy as it's practiced here. So I wondered if you could think sort of beyond the individual, or sort of between the individual and the community, and think about the concept of humility in institutions, what that might look like, how we could foster it, if such a thing exists. What is a civil discourse between institutions or institutions and communities? I'll leave it at that. Any takers?
It's your turn.
I can't
Oh,
even,
you went
make a
first.
noise, and it's like being at an auction.
Do I hear?
Well, I like benefiting from what everybody says, but I'm going to start this off. So, and I'm going to start maybe with an example. I've noticed working interdisciplinarily, so I had an appointment in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and also an appointment in the School of Education, and it's at the same university, and yet there are quite different cultures in some respects, right? And now I'm working closely with a colleague in the Department of Mathematics within the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and again, quite different cultures in a way. And there are challenges, of course, because when you say something and you're not immediately understood, or you misunderstand something, you have a choice. You can either turn around and say, this is way too difficult, or you can say, wait a minute, what can I learn here? And I've just learned, no matter what difference I face, I always learn no matter what it is. And a challenge is an opportunity, a problem is an opportunity, a different opinion, no matter how different, is an opportunity. I've also worked closely with schools and noticed that there are many preconceptions in a way that teachers might feel a university professor comes in and maybe tells us what to do, and that's sometimes the case. I call those the hit and run, hit and run studies, right? I'm studying what you do, I'm not doing it with you. And I've learned that I want to do research with people, so that people in the schools, students, teachers, plan with us, they work with us, and I'm learning more than they learn probably. I would like to teach more, but I learn more. And that's what I always notice. So I think on the one hand, modeling early might help, that difference is good, that again, challenges are good, to ask questions is good, that some misunderstandings can be solved with perseverance sometimes. So I think a lot can be done, which doesn't mean that there is no arrogance anywhere and that I'm not arrogant in many ways. So I think it's a lifelong process, and I'm going to continue to learn, hopefully.
I'm gonna go second because I heard you whisper to her that you didn't want to go anymore. So, you know, this is a very powerful question, and I don't know if we have enough time to actually address it as deep as we need to, but I'll do my very best. Now, you talk about institutions, and the first thing that came to my mind was prison. I've spent time in prison, and there's a certain environment and a certain mentality that a corrections officer and an inmate have right as soon as they meet. It's your power and I am powerless. When you feel powerless and you're coming from a society or a community where you felt power, now you are going to encounter someone who is looking to take all your power from you. Instantly you have a conflict. And it's instant because, one, you don't know one another. Two, you've been educated in whatever form the institution educated the corrections officer, and you were educated by the community or the street you came from. So when you talk about whether there can be civility, it all depends on, from the top to the bottom, what kind of education you actually are being provided by the institution that's been charged to employ you, to have you be a leader. And then also has to do with the education that you've received as a child and what you feel a challenge is and how you respond to an aggressor, someone who is now demeaning you, someone who hasn't studied you or learned you and then now is telling you to lock up or sit down, shut up, shower now. And not knowing and understanding that maybe you came from an environment where you were bullied by your father and you have no tolerance for being bullied. So that's why this is such a deep, complex issue, because it has to do not only with the training that you've received, but it also has to do with financial means for institutions that make billions of dollars from incarceration. I can continue going on that platform. But it's also something that, as a male, and I can speak to being a male who was a victim and then victimized folks, you are expected to have a certain level of intolerance to what you feel are people oppressing you. So how do you have civility in an environment where the institution is trained to smother you and you're trained to fight back, to have a standard or a standing? And now I wanted to mention where I am today with the Peace Center of Connecticut, and the reason why I feel that my institution can do that is because I have a set of morals and values and expectations of myself that every single person within my group will make sure to have to adhere to, and that I will make sure that is followed, because they are an extension of me. And we will be civil, we will be respectful, we'll be humble. But this is a very difficult subject, great question, because to answer it today would mean we're geniuses. You guys are brilliant, don't get me wrong. But institutional civility really will have to start by not only starting earlier, like you mentioned, and but also really taking a hard look at ourselves and the institutions that we favor to see how each and every person is being trained. And that's a heck of an order to call on. But thank you for the question. I have to think a little more for that one, but thank you, I appreciate it.
Thanks for the answer.
That was well said, Iran. Because every organization, governmental body, neighborhood, can take on levels of arrogance. Families can take on arrogance. Races can take on arrogance. Football teams take on arrogance. And how do we live in a society where there are always all of these arrogant silos?
Yeah.
How do we commingle in a way that it becomes community? I guess at this point we've had great difficulty with that, but the one thing that can do it is to recognize that every single one of us has something in common. I may not have ever met you, but there's something in common that we have, something within that silo that causes us to be similar in a way. We just have to find it. And when Rabbi was speaking of that internal journey within, what it does cause is humility. Again, as a clergy, one of the things that I know about God is that God is profoundly forgiving, but it's because God has forgiven me. And so there's nothing that someone can do that I haven't already done to myself. You cannot find your worth in the anger towards somebody else. Your worth is buried within you, and that's the journey that we must find. Because every single person has worth. And somehow on occasion it's beaten out of them, trained out of them, convinced one way or the other. So it becomes our job to be the witnesses of the worth of others.
I don't know, I'm just going to say what came to my mind when you asked. It's a very interesting question. We always say at Charter Oak that the inside has to match the outside. So, if we're doing the work of social justice through the arts and we're providing, I could easily go right into a commercial. I can feel it in myself for Charter Oak, so I don't want to do that. But if we do these things that we think of as kind and right and moral and leveling the playing field and giving people the opportunity to do all kinds of things in the arts, we can't. We have to go inside too, just like we were talking about people going inside. We have to go inside too and make sure that we're treating each other with kindness and compassion. And I think that one of the problems is that there's been this kind of encroachment of, I guess, just kind of capitalism run amok, where what becomes most important is money, and what becomes most important is self-aggrandizement and all that kind of pushing. And you always have to be vigilant, I think, about that. And I think that's what makes institutions arrogant, when they are not doing the same kind of soul-searching that people need to do. And it's a hard tide, I think, to fight, because it's kind of now in the air that we're moving towards just a real focus on things, and as a culture, as a society, especially what's going on in politics right now, rather than money and again self-aggrandizement as opposed to people. And the biblical story that keeps occurring to me, and I think that this maybe speaks to this, is the Tower of Babel, right? So these people are building this tower, and then when a brick falls, they cry, but when a person falls off from building the tower, they don't care. The builders don't care. And that's, I think, what happens sometimes with institutions. Sometimes we just lose our way. We lose our priorities, and this encroachment of these kind of values where we prioritize money and getting ahead and all those things, and we go astray.
Yeah, very good question, very interesting answers. I mean, I was sitting there thinking about my own institution where I work at, and some of the difficulties of getting them to move on some of the issues that I care a lot about, like faculty diversity and other kinds of issues on campus. But it sort of strikes me that institutions are made of people, and we worry when we sort of talk about them too abstractly, because it's really made of people, and I think that's a big part of the challenge, because you've got to move a lot of people. You've got to get a lot of people to take more seriously those things that are perhaps marginalizing people in the environment, and that's part of the challenge, I think, for doing that. My final question, and this one stems from the fact that I'm a political scientist, and so I'll ask a political science-y kind of question. So perhaps in no other area of American life has there been a greater collapse of humility and civility than within our nation's political system. Politics is conflictual, reflecting deep differences of opinion, rooted in self-interest, ideology, and personal beliefs. To get things done, bargaining and compromise are essential. Getting everything one wants rarely occurs. Politics can always bring another day, another chance to be heard, to persuade, and perhaps to gain parts of what one wants. These are things I learned in my high school civics class. These are things that I teach my students in my American politics class. Yet, in our nation's schools today, there appears to have been a shift from civics to job preparation. Is there a connection between the lack of humility and incivility and the retreat from civic learning? If you do see a connection, how do we reinvigorate civic learning for citizens and communities, which I think occur and has to occur in more than just our schools, but certainly our schools are a key place for that to occur? You can do it first.
I was volunteered.
They look deep in thought. You like you had the answer right now.
We did not get these questions ahead of time.
It's true.
They're wonderful questions, though. So I don't have the answer. I have an approach that we are taking currently with colleagues. So when I hear civics, so I teach foreign language education, applied linguistics, intercultural competence, and the way colleagues and I incorporate civics education for democracy is actually intercultural citizenship. That's a theory that Michael Byram in England developed a while ago. And what it does, it combines intercultural competence. And intercultural competence is really not just seen as knowledge of another culture, but really the skills of engaging in effective dialogue with somebody who has different values, different opinions from oneself. And that those are skills, that's attitudes, being open-minded, having tolerance of ambiguity. I see something different and I have to deal with it, right? It's also knowledge. Knowledge is part of that, and that's where intellectual humility comes in. And in the end, there is critical cultural awareness. So we want to move away from, oh, it's all good, I just want to be tolerant of everything, because there are certain things we cannot be tolerant of, right? Mm-hmm. And so we want to have this critical cultural awareness where we judge an event, a document, a situation based on specific criteria, and hopefully from different perspectives, right? So their intellectual humility comes in quite a bit, and that interaction of how I gained that knowledge. If that is actually linked with political action, and not necessarily political action in the sense of partisan political action, but doing something about a problem together in the here and now, rather than waiting for later on, that's what we call intercultural citizenship. And so those are the kinds of activities, units that we are trying to integrate in quite a few schools right now in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And I've worked together with teachers and with the mathematician and other colleagues. What I do want to say, though, about politics and that divide, right? I might open another can of worms, but I'm known for that. Universities often are known to be quite liberal, right? If we talk about partisan politics here. And not all universities, but universities sometimes are more in that camp. And I want to say that I think it's extremely important that we help our students be able to voice their opinions no matter what they are, unless they hurt human rights. And I have a story here that really taught me a lesson a long time ago. I was teaching a German class in which we discuss all the time, and we have all kinds of controversial topics. And I do not go towards a certain solution, here's the solution to that problem, but quite often students have quite liberal views. And a student who was often dressed in wide flowing skirts and had long hair came up to me one time after class, and she said, "Manuela, can I talk to you?" And I said, "Of course." So we sat in my office, and she said, "You know, I look like a hippie. My opinions are not that of a hippie. I'm very conservative." And she gave me some examples. And she said, sometimes in my education here, I felt that I could not really say what I want to say. But in this class, I noticed you actually want us to tell different opinions. So I'm grateful for that, and I want to make sure that this continues to happen. And I was so happy that she told me that, right? And so I try to really integrate, and also in the projects, to make sure that students actually not only say what their opinion is, but investigate another perspective. That they go out into the world, put themselves, if they can, somehow they cannot feel it, but they can put themselves a little bit in the shoes of a different perspective, and then come back wiser, right? Doesn't mean that they have to change their opinion or their belief or their value, but they understand each other to some degree. And that is sometimes really by giving roles and not saying, just tell me what you think, but here you are now for the death penalty, even if you're really against it. What would be the points that you would make? And that's a strong topic. That goes towards identity and so on. That's an example, right? So that's just, I will stop here. Sorry for taking the floor too long.
No, that's fine. Do we have a volunteer to go next?
I'll give it what I can.
All right.
See, in all candor, a couple of years ago was the first time I ever voted in my life for anyone. As a federal combat, I didn't have rights to vote for a long time. When I finally was able to, I voted based on my studies of individuals that I felt were treating others well. But it wasn't, I didn't have a platform. I don't know the agendas enough. I'm not well versed in politics. So when you talk about civics and civic engagement, you know, regardless of whether you're with one party or another, I think many of the labels were designed to separate and divide us anyway. So my focus in civics, or when I talk to young people about their roles and their voices, is look to connect with the person who you know is going to treat people with kindness and have in mind and in their behavior and in their actions and their attitudes the best interests of our community and our society and your future. Because not knowing the political landscape as well as I may need to, or buying into just one agenda, I think makes me blind to other people's opinions. So when it comes to civic engagement or civic duty, I always say this, but I stay in my lane. I know what I know and I don't know what I don't know, so I don't preach or share anyone's propaganda, agenda, or anything like that. But what I do inform young people to do, or people that I've connected with in that arena, is to go where your heart tells you to go and where you feel right. As long as you are not hurting someone else physically, emotionally, stand firm with where you are, but understand what you're doing, and understand and listen and open your ears to listen more than you say, and then once you know, then you talk. But this again is one of those topics that's difficult for me to get involved with, because as a recent, I consider myself a young voter, right? Because I just don't know the platform well enough. But I can say what I look for in candidates and I look for in the messaging is to learn them well enough, and then figure out if their treatment of others is worthy of my vote, is worthy of my participation. And that's kind of like where I am right now as I learn to become more civically involved myself.
You could be last. Yeah, both in terms of how we are, how our nation is nationally and even local politics, and how we interact with one another and who we are. More often than not, we respond out of fear, anger and hatred. The opposite of incivility, or the opposite of civility, isn't hatred, it's fear. And I think nationally what we are seeing is the response to the fear of the change that I think people saw when President Obama came into office. I was in Colorado recently, and a woman came up to me and she said she can't stand Spanish anymore, and she was feeling guilty, but she didn't like to hear it. And then she said, you know, they're taking over our country. And so I took her outside in Colorado, and you could see 100 miles everywhere. And I said, there's enough room. Well, and what I meant is that her thoughts were influenced by this fear that on an anecdotal level, she had seen something, heard something, and listened to that news station. And we know which news station of which I speak. But it is that kind of thing that we have to guard against, the fear of others or the fear of other. If we could get a hold of that. And in terms of how institutions work and institutional anger and the like, as a Catholic, one of the things, and I know all religious organizations look to their institutions as a method by which they can spread their individual good news. But if the Catholic Church were successful at it, the Lutheran churches that were successful at it, the Jewish hospitals and temples and schools were good at it, those who were going into the schools, like Catholic schools, the children would come out Catholic. But the institution doesn't do that. If the Catholic Church were doing something really well in their hospitals, people would come out of the hospitals, changed or evangelized. What I have come to recognize is this. Individually, we change one another. Your school can't change anyone, but a professor can. Because it is in that individual relationship, because we can all think back to that teacher that helped us. And it wasn't the school, it was the teacher. It wasn't the nurse or the hospital, it was that doctor or that nurse. It wasn't the church, it was that minister. It wasn't this, it was that person. If we recognize our ability to change folks as an individual, looking deep within and walking with them in their walk, then we could change this world. I was once told by one of my brothers, Art, you're not going to change the world. And I know, I'm an activist, but I'm going to change my part. I don't expect to write somebody else's book, that's their job. But if I can add a period or a sentence or a comma to help them in their book and how it's edited, then that's my role. And I am unafraid to do that.
It's an interesting question, if I got it right, this kind of correlation between the lack of civics education and the lack of civility. And I think that's, I have to think more about it, but I think that's part of the issue. But I think there are other things that we need to teach too. I think we need to teach, I made a little list, bear with me. I think we need to teach, Manuela, you were saying this, curiosity, critical thinking. I think that's one of the reasons we're in the situation we're in, that we haven't taught people how to think critically. And that goes back to the question about social media too. You know, just kind of believing anything that you see without kind of engaging your own mind to discern, well, does that sound true? You know, let me look at some other sources. Nonviolent communication, you know, again, being able to express our opinions without putting somebody else down. Listening skills, and how to hold each other's humanity as we discuss difficult things. And then civics. I think it is important. I think it does contribute to kind of setting up the parameters within which we can have civil discourse. I don't know why this just keeps coming up in my mind, so I just want to say it. I think I was inspired by what you said. One of the people who was killed in the church last year. Was it just last year when people were killed in South Carolina? Was it 2 years ago? It seems so raw that it seems like it just happened. What she used to say was, I think you're right, it was 2 years ago. She used to say, "Be kinder than necessary."
Amen.
Thank you very much. So I just want to be mindful of time because we do want to make sure that the audience members have an opportunity to ask questions. So I have many questions, but I think I'm going to I think Bilal's question was a really tremendous question as a way to segue us out into taking questions from the audience. So if you'd like to address a question to our panelists, please let us know and we'll make sure that you get a microphone. And if you do ask a question, the one thing that we ask of you is if you would not mind identifying yourself.
May I add something? Or if you want to disagree.
Civilly and humbly, though, I think that's it. So if you do have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring you up.
This is a comment. My name is Richard Orr. A couple of weeks ago, Brendan and the Humanities Project had a program on faith and politics in the context of humility and conviction. And David Gergen, who served Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan, but also Clinton, so has a broad range, was asked for hopeful signs about the public sector. And one's kind of an aside. He said in the 2016 cycle, Emily's List got a request from 1,000 women. And in this cycle, they've gotten requests for help from 34,000 women. But that's not the point. The point was he was asked for a second sign of reason for optimism. He talked about the Parkland kids. The kids from Parkland High School and how they have not just had a rally, but are sustaining and moving forward in a constructive way. And he was asked, what do you attribute that to? And he said, they have a superb civics program in their high school. And if you learn civics, you learn the compromise between a Senate and a House, one population-based, one based on state. You learn about the compromise between the legislature and the courts. You get to legislate, but you're called into account. You learn about horrible compromises, like 2/3 of a human being. But you learn that the country was founded on compromise, conciliation, and collaboration. And in the absence of civics education, those principles don't get demonstrated in contemporary politics. So I'm channeling David Gergen, but I wonder if you have reactions to that.
Thank you very much, Rich.
Well, I'm giving it to my two because I learned this from you, my brother. You know, when you mentioned the historical lessons that we've been taught, you know, this country and this nation, based on what I've learned recently, really didn't have the buy-in of all of its citizens and all of its human beings, if you consider the atrocities against African Americans and Latinos who had no voice or decision in some of the things that these Parkland young people have learned to march against. What I think, having worked with young people for over 20 plus years, they've always had a voice, right? They've always wanted to speak. They've always been, it is the resources, lack thereof, that will define how a young person will speak. And unfortunately for some of the communities that are malnourished, ill-equipped, underfunded, poverty-stricken, their voices are shared with gunfire and self-pain and pity and destruction. So although I do celebrate that community of young people, we actually had a rally here in Hartford I was participating in. The facts are that there's so much more that we have to do to bring that same level of influence and impact into some of these communities that are still not being heard. And that's kind of like where I'm at, and I applaud you for bringing that up, because I think these young people are our future. My son is sitting right there, an 18-year-old beautiful young man. And the facts are that we are going to be the teachers of these young people. And I'll leave it at that, but yeah, there's a lot to be discussed, for sure.
Indignation. I was a part of the student upheaval in the 60s. When I was 17, I was arrested, and it was the fodder for the civil rights movement was young people. My wife and I have been waiting for 50 years for another group to give voice to the angst, the indignation of the horrid incivility and violence that permeates our society. I recognize that there was a particular moment when Emmett Till was murdered, that all of the confluences that exist came into that one point. There was Rosa Parks, who had been to school to learn about civil disobedience. There was a circumstance in Montgomery, Alabama, and a young minister by the name of Martin Luther King was coming to fore. So all of these things were happening. Emmett Till happened to be from Chicago, a city who had a beloved community that understood who they were and what they were and would not sit down for any kind of a violence. There was a publisher by the name of George Johnson, who produced Jet magazine, who was willing to put that picture on the face of his face in Jet magazine. It happened to be that President Eisenhower, was in a debate with Nikita Khrushchev about civil disobedience and human rights violations in Russia, when Nikita Khrushchev put that down in front of him and said, "Don't talk to me about non-human rights when this is happening in your country." So all of these things came to that point. I believe that even though there is just a plethora of young folks like Aran and like many of the people that I work with who and mothers who see the death of their children and their voices aren't heard, I'm willing to say right now, at this point, I am so happy that there is some hope. It's such hope when we see that black women in Alabama pushed that politician, the Democrat, over the line. I think right now that the person who sits in the president's seat right now is sparking such a response that those who may not have had hope before have hope again, because of the desire to overthrow something that they seem to feel is repugnant. So there is hope. There's always a message in the mess. And I would suggest to you that there is a mess right now, but there's a message that can come out of that. I think we're all better when we come out of the valley of the shadow of death. And that's Psalm 23rd. The 23rd Psalm is, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil." It does not say, "Thank you for giving me some Nike so I can walk around it." It says that we do walk through difficult moments. And when you go through those difficult moments, the second you come out of that, you're that much better. But be forewarned, it doesn't say there's another one, that there's not another one afterward. So.
Yeah, amen. I love what David Gergen said, and you said it very well, I think. I've been thinking of this time as, you ever put peroxide on a wound?
Yes.
And how, it gurgles up and right? I feel like that's what we're living through, that there were all these things that were buried, and there was a festering wound, and, I think a lot of people in the dominant culture just didn't get it. And now it's all coming to the surface, and that is very painful, and it's also very hopeful, and it's our best opportunity to heal.
Because the healing is in the pain.
You good?
I'm Kyron Nazario. I'm the son of this brilliant man right here. So what I've been thinking, I recently took civics, so everything y'all talking about is right there. All of it. And I just feel that, especially because I can speak for my generation, that a lot of us feel oppressed by all the things because you're thinking man, we have all these grown people who aren't really they're trying to do something, but they can't push hard enough. How can we match up to that? We don't even have the education that they do. And just by looking at that and just going through those classes and all the debates and seeing how everybody reacts to each other, I feel that that civics thing is really necessary, because it can really change your outlook on things, and you can actually start to see why things are happening and stop putting the blames on other things. Because like it's me, like when I looked at the prison system and I seen like all the rates for people who were like colored and they were getting incarcerated, and some people would be like, oh, it's the cops, blah blah blah. But it's not really the cops. The cops are being told basically by where they work for, watch out for these people, watch out for these minorities. And you can't really do anything against that. Like I watched a documentary at one time, and it was about how when cocaine started like spreading around, when it got really popular, there would be like the white people would mostly have like the powdered cocaine, and then like more in like the suburbs, like they had that, and then more like the urban areas, there was like the rocks, because like they couldn't really afford to get it into that kind of powder and all that. So if you were to get caught with that and you were a minority, you could face like multiple years in prison, and then your dudes who was living in the suburbs could get like a slap on the wrist, not even really anything, just because they're like a different substance, but also because of the divide that we've always had when it came to race. And there's just a lot of kids who, even though we've been battling this for so long, ever since this, like the beginning, we've been fighting this, and there's people still to this day who are affected to it. Like I know my children are still going to be affected by this, and that's crazy to think about that, because I'm way far away from having kids. And so
We're gonna go right
But yeah, I mean, like, I feel like everything y'all was saying is just really hitting me, and I'm glad that I know about it, because I want to be one of those people who can speak for the people who I'm around, because a lot of people will be like, oh, you're old, what do you know, get out of my face. Like, but it's just like, then I talk to them, they're just like, wow, like this person is like growing up with me, so they probably understand me more. So I feel like, God could drop down a couple more Gandhis and stuff, that'd be cool. So, yeah, so, but, yeah.
Thank you for that comment. Thanks so much. I just wanted to say real quickly, because it's sort of the question I asked has sort of triggered this conversation, and it was also something that Artie said earlier. At the University of Hartford, I teach a course called How to Change the World. And what's interesting for me, at least, about the course, I mean, the focus is really on, what I do in the course is I present to students young people like them who are doing things all around the world, right? And so they read about these people who, in many ways, are just like them. I show them films about the Greensboro sit-in movement and films about other parts of the civil rights movement. And one of the things I try to get them to understand is that these are young people just like them, right? We look back now, when we see them on TV, today they look much older, but they were just like you. When the Greensboro sit-in occurred, these were 4 freshman students who did that. And so part of my message to them, and this sort of made me sort of think about your comment about what someone said about changing the world, what I say to them is that what you can't do and what you should not set out to do is to save the world. But I say you do have the potential to change the world, right? And so to me, those are 2 very different missions. One is much larger, and people have failed at that mission. But I say certainly young people who went in, sat at a lunch counter after a semester of working with each other and sort of prodding and pushing and encouraging and debating about the merits of doing that, and going to their families asking for permission to do this because of the potential consequences of that. And then the 4 of them did something that ultimately did change the world, right? But it wasn't what they set out to do. It was very local, it was very particular, it was about how it was affecting them, but also how they felt about the previous generation. And what they said is that, okay, you guys didn't do that, we're gonna do this. And so I say to you, don't wait on us. Do it yourself and get out there, and it's good to see you've got a great role model for doing that. And so really appreciate your comments.
Can I say one more last thing? If it's okay?
Sure.
I was a soon-to-be freshman at the University of Illinois when I was arrested. And at the time, you don't know that you're making history. You don't know anything. It's just something important right there at that moment in that place. And it's not that you want to change the world, it's that you have to change something. It is estimated that it was only 5% of the population participated in any meaningful way in the civil rights movement. 5%. And yet that 5% did change the world. The question becomes, there are 40 people in here. If there were 40 young people, that means only 2 would have done anything. Are you one of the 2? And that's what you aspire to be. Just 5%, because 5% can do almost anything.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Thank you so much. My name is Leslie Mansell. I don't think that mic is working.
No, but it's for
Okay. My name is Leslie Mansell. I'm a resident here in Hartford. Hello, Rabbi Berman. And an artist and a mother. And just a comment, my thought on humility and civility. We used to call it manners, training, how you were brought up, you know, what your elders teach you. And so from my hippy-dippy day, my comment is, you are what you eat, but you can change your diet. So it's, you know, you might have been fed good things as a child, but you decided to just eat candy and junk food when you get older, but you could change and start eating the brown rice and the salad and the good things. A lot of America is being fed some negativity today, and as a result, we have all this divisiveness going on, you know, using the terminology, the title of this here session. And it's so sad that they're being fed, America is being fed all this junk food, all this stuff that is just not good for us, and we're just being torn apart. So I think we need to be more civil. I think we need civility taught more in the high schools, and perhaps in the junior high and in the elementary schools, so that our kids can learn that you don't have to, you know, be a man, be a macho, and act in this certain way because somebody stepped on your toe, or you don't have to, I can't even think of an idea for us young ladies, an example for the young ladies, but we have to learn to be kinder and nicer to each other, and everyone's not getting it at home, so we have to, the schools have to take that back, and in the community, and I loved someone here earlier said, at the stores, you know, in the supermarket, everywhere you go, be kind to each other. So I just want to reiterate, I think that's all good stuff. Thank you all.
Thank you. I had a question. My name is Jackie Santiago, and I work with Compass Youth Collaborative. So as a part of my work, I've consistently tried to work with youth on teaching kindness and humility, and we do that through, you know, developing some of the things that you were talking about in terms of critical thinking, perspective taking. Those are all executive functions of the brain, and, you know, some of us are more fortunate to have a better diet for a very long time and are fed good things, and therefore our brain develops differently. However, I wanted to see from your perspective, the panelists, what you would say to youth when you're asked what the difference is between humility and weakness. Because a lot of the kids now are thinking that, you know, they have to be like Jesus and turn the other cheek every single time, and that's not going to be what they do because they can't survive that way. So what would you say?
somebody want? I don't have a real answer. I have some thoughts on it, if that's okay. If somebody has a real answer, please. So, we've been thinking about that, right? So, for example, you teach humility, and you teach it in a context where humility is not necessarily appreciated outside of the classroom, right? Or can have detrimental effects outside of the classroom. And we have thought about, so how do we approach this? What do we do? So one thing is to be really clear about what you teach when you teach humility. You don't necessarily teach modesty. You don't necessarily teach saying you don't know something when you know something. You teach owning the limitations of your knowledge, which also means owning what you know. So I think focusing on that cognitive aspect helps there. I think we still need to be cognizant of misunderstandings. There are different ages when we can talk about this, when we can say, listen, when we talk about intellectual humility, here's what we mean. And then there are ages where maybe we do it more through activities and we don't necessarily make it clear, and then we have to be very careful that students don't, in a job interview, that they're not overly humble when they actually should show what they can do in certain contexts, right? So that all needs to be taught, I think. But I think intellectual humility, I personally have, for myself, decided is still a very good tool to learn how to know what you know and learn more if you don't know something, and learn to collaborate and use cooperative skills with people to find out more. So it does still make you stronger. It does not necessarily mean I'm treated badly and I say it's all okay. Thank you.
So I think beyond critical thinking, we need to maybe coin something like critical friending, right? Critical association. And what I mean by that is, you know, I grew up that way. I grew up confronting every single aggression with aggression, and I got into a lot of trouble for it. I didn't have the lessons of humility and civility, patience and tolerance for other people. How I would answer your question, having been a mediator of conflicts for many years, one of the things that I noticed about many systems, and when we talk about institutions, is a lack of acceptance in some communities that young people need to learn about conflict resolution, mediation, tolerance at an extremely early age. Because by the time some of these young people start to actually hear those terms, they've already assaulted someone or someone they know has been assaulted. It is a very difficult and challenging, time in young people's lives when aggression seems to heal the pain that they feel, right? Because again, being someone who was a perpetrator and a victim, I felt pleasure and satisfaction in being in fights, either being hurt or hurting someone, because it was my release. So without having young people succumb to being victimized all of the time, I think that we as a community need to identify who in the community can teach these skills to these young people all of the time. Aggression doesn't rest, violence doesn't rest, anger doesn't rest, and neither should the efforts of people in the community. And we need to continue to look at the assets that we have in these communities to start teaching our young people from an early age that there is some value, an extreme amount of value, in making a decision to walk away from something. But not just that walk away, that somebody intervenes that is able to meet with both parties, 10 parties, whatever it is, constantly, consistently, to be able to model the behavior and provide the safety for these young people to feel like I can save face because I have people who support me, and I have a protection from adults and others that'll keep me safe. Because it's about, as funny as it is, Art Miller mentioned it earlier, and I can speak to this, like if it was yesterday. Fear controlled a lot of my responses. And fear is controlling a lot of the responses in these young people. Fear of being not accepted, fear of being hurt, fear of being victimized again, fear of losing popularity or not being known for being weak or soft or whatever it is. And much of that fear has to do with not being educated on how precious your life is and how walking away actually makes you more powerful. So it's a long-winded answer because it's a complex issue, but I think that the more we reach further down and grab young people at an early age and teach them about what conflict and walking away actually means for them in the future, that the better results that we'll have.
I think what Iran is saying, and I think we all believe, is that the process of being able to walk away and the difference between not being perceived as being weak or soft and being willing to walk away was planted years before that moment happened. As Rabbi said, it is this great understanding of self and love of self, because love of self defers very much fear. I don't have to worry what the community concerns itself with, how I am, because I know. So if it didn't happen years beforehand for that individual at that moment, it's not going to happen. There's no critical thinking, speaking, or anything else that's going to stop that at that moment. But if we don't begin to train that community, train that village in a very early stage, as was said, but it could also be done in the college, in schools. It also can be done in parishes, in mosques, in churches, in temples. It can be taught everywhere. But it is that internal walk within to learn how precious you are and that no one takes my peace. I deal with our political circumstance right now because I am not going to allow that person to take my peace.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I just want
Please
to.
do.
It's such a good question. And Iran said it so well. Aggression just leads to aggression, and it just keeps escalating. So, I was thinking that in reality, humility is disarming, like literally, And that's not to say that you lay down and play dead like a possum, but because you can have boundaries. But from that place of humility, I think you can ground your anger, you can ground your passion for justice, and you can respond in a way that doesn't kind of just keep escalating everything. The only other thing I wanted to say is, we talked a lot about the term political correctness. It was always a derisive term. It was not the original. People started saying, we should talk to each other in a civil way. And then this negative kind of loaded term was applied to it. So it was, we have to be PC, have to be PC. And then you hear a lot of people still talking about, with resentment, talking about that term. And I remember years ago in Ms. Magazine, I think the editor at the time, Robin Morgan, said, you know what PC stands for? It stands for plain courtesy.
So we have a couple more questions, and again, just trying to be mindful of time. If perhaps you could ask your questions. We'll take both questions that are on the floor, and if there are others, we'll take them all in one go. So, but again, if you could introduce yourself, that'd be fantastic.
Excuse me, let me introduce myself. My name is Jerry Pleasant. I'm the retired deputy police chief here in Hartford. But let me give you a backdrop of who I am and how I grew up. I'm a graduate of the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico. After there, I only spent 2.5 years there. I applied to Cornell University and I was accepted. And I traveled from Hartford to 34th Street in New York City, Manhattan, to Cornell. That's the School of Labor and Management. And I graduated from Cornell. One of the things that I consider myself quite qualified to comment on is public safety. I'm one of those individuals who have traveled, and I am one of those individuals who get the weekly printout on what in the hell's going on in your neighborhood. The whole city, by neighborhood, by crime, what's going on. And I'll tell you right now, I live in the quietest area of the city with the least amount of crime, the southwest portion of the city. Check it out for yourself. It has the least amount of crime. One of the things you need to do is get to know who your city councilman is. You need to get to know your public safety. That's the whole police department I refer to as the public safety branch of the city. Who's in charge? Who's responsible? Who is the individual that coordinates with your particular neighborhood? Because that's the man or woman you're going to need to sit down and talk to and explain to him or her, here are my problems. And he or she will explain to you what they have on their crime sheet. Very important. Because most of you have children. You need to talk to your children as to what's going on. You need to talk to them as the do's and don'ts of neighborhood travel. Yes, there's some neighborhoods you keep your ass away from. And that's for your own safety. And also, it's for your safety too, the adult. I'm also in a position to get to know a lot of the politicians in the city. We have some very good people here. We have our bow wows too, but we have some very good people. Get to know who's who. And because you may be surprised, this city has the opportunity to move forward. If you have any questions, feel free.
Thank you.
I came of age during the Civil Rights Movement. We're probably around the same age, but you're probably younger. My question is, those of us that are a little long in the tooth, I would like to open up dialogue with young people, because I think that's, for me, my frustration. But having had the benefit and the pleasure of living in a 3-generation household, and had these conversations with my own grandson, sharing my story with him and what it was like. But I would like to see that kind of scaled up, where those of us that were activists in our generation, I don't think we've had those conversations with our young people, that dialogue. And we do, as older people, need to be humble and hear what they have to say, and not always think that we have lessons to impart on them, but also that we can learn from them, particularly the technical stuff. I'm not proud to call him when I need help, but I mean, beyond that, I think that we've lost that continuity, because I remember elders teaching me sort of the ropes and how to be civil and the sense of responsibility and giving back. But I think that somehow or another it's broken down. And I think we need to get back to that. We need to share each other's stories and get to understand each other, not just across cultures, but across generations. And I really would like to see a way to do that.
Very quick comment.
As they
Very,
pass
very
the
quick.
microphone to...
Very quick. I've been wanting to say this for a while, and I'm sorry. I think in education we do have the responsibility to do all those things, to break down the walls and to really say, instead of learning something for later on, we are applying it right now, right, all those things, which also means cross-generational. So there are activities that you can do where 3rd graders, 1st graders can go out and interview their parents, their grandparents, their community, and really break down the classroom walls right here and now and learn from each other and with each other.
The background on my question is
Introduce
that...
yourself.
Pardon?
Introduce yourself.
Oh,
Let us know who you are.
Dave Porteous. I'm retired. I worked at UConn. I worked for the state police, and I was active in the civil rights. I'm just a little bit younger from you, if I can guess from what I read. Slightly. Just a slight bit. It doesn't matter at this point. We're alive and well. That's the important thing. And the background is that a person I know, a friend of mine who's a very noted philosopher, wrote a letter to the New York Times in December, actually it was Christmas Eve of 2015, called Dear White America. And, you know, the response was generally awful, and his book about it, called Backlash, which just came out last month. George Yancey. Yes. Yeah. You should read it, because after reading that, and I was, you know, been in communication with him about it, oh my God, I decided, okay, one of the things that I can do to try to make a difference from the white world perspective is try to figure out how to have discussions about race, which is one of the hardest things in the world. So I've begun doing that with, you know, a few family and friends who kind of share my values, and it's really hard. And the best conversation I had was with a man yesterday who is doing some work. He's a former policeman and has a security system, and we were talking about race because he'd looked at an article, and he's African American, that I'd written, and I had a wonderful conversation. It was much more open than with my friends and family who don't want to talk about it. So I'm trying to figure out how to, you know, down the road, from a humble perspective, because I've learned a lot about, you know, myself over the decades and in the last several years, how to create those conversations about race, especially because, you know, we're the people who created it, the white people, and we're the people who don't understand it. And, you know, taking backlash is one of the options. Say, hey, you know, read this. It was a loving article from my perspective, and how to do that. So I'm just wondering, you know, how do we do that? My God, we have to do that. That's
Thanks, David. So we have 3 questions on the table, and since we have about 15 minutes, if we can have our panelists respond to any, all, call an audible, and do whatever you wish, and then we can have some concluding remarks. So just to recap briefly, we have Jerry's comment about knowing your council person and knowing your neighborhood. And I'm sorry, ma'am, I missed your name. I missed your name.
Oh, I didn't give it, that's why. I didn't play by the rules. Pat Rice.
Pat. And Pat's question about intergenerational dialogue, which is really important, and David's comment about how do we start conversations and dialogues about race. So.
Oh, God.
It doesn't need to be.
All right, so I'm going to call it an audible and address the last question. And to share a quick story, because I know we have limited time. When I was at the UConn School of Social Work, I had a young lady named Amy who was an intern from the suburbs at UConn. And I brought her into Hartford, and she was terrified the entire ride-in because she had learned about Hartford through the news. Oh, so here I was, an active gang member working at the School of Social Work with my colors on, taking her into the city.
Yes, yes,
Right.
yes.
So I bring her into the city, and she's telling me how am I doing this and what's going to happen. And I said, chill. Exact words I said, chill, you're with me. I know the guys, you're going to be fine. Today, she's a supervisor at a youth service organization many, many years later. And she learned very quickly that it wasn't the color of her skin, that it was a service that she provided and the heart that she had for community, and changed her. So I said all that to say this. There are people out here that need your voice and need you to be present to have those conversations. Use us as assets and connections to those people that you want to talk to. They love and respect us, and they can learn to love and respect you too, because through associations with us, they'll start to look at you as someone who's a friend of mine. And looking at you as a friend of mine, they start to open up to your human side versus looking at your skin color. If you're dealing with me, then they'll deal with you. And that's what I would have to say to your question. It's possible. I've seen it. I've done it. And we're here if you want to have that conversation.
Thank you. I worked at the school, so
Ms. Rice, I work at schools to talk about the civil rights movement, to speak with young people all over, frankly, the country, to do exactly that. My brother, your single conversation, we don't know how it will impact now. What's important is to have the conversation. To begin a thought process, to not allow a terrible statement to go unchallenged. That is what we do. It begins to be an ego thing if we want to see the change before us, to see it happen instantly once they hear our golden words. It just doesn't work that way. It is that look at self that has to proclaim the truth. And that's all that we can do. If we're more concerned about seeing them change, then we're more concerned about ourselves than anything else, because the objective is to tell our truth and let it lie, and the love of self allows that. And in terms of conversations, I am amazed how many people want to hear the stories of going to jail, of sitting, and how do you deal with people who are yelling and spitting at you, as was done, and what kind of training that you have at 17 years old that sparked that desire to make a change in a community, in a world that was not ready for it. And for young folks, I often hear, we are standing on your shoulders, and my response is, get off. And the reason is, if you stay on my shoulders, the only place you're going is where I've been. And so you need to get off my shoulders, knowing that we will be here to help lift you up, protect you, and help you, but it's up to you to get your nose broken and to go out there and do, well, I know your dad won't like that, but yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. But the truth is, young folks you have a voice, and some won't listen to it, but remember, 5% of our nation change this world. Okay.
Thank you. And so this is also interesting, and I raised this more as a question, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But when I talk about, so I try to talk about issues that are really complicated and complex, and I'm not shying away from it anymore, and I'm telling TAs I'm teaching, and they're teaching German classes, not to shy away from complex issues, even in first-year German, because we need to talk about those issues, right? One important lesson, and this is really more a question for all of you and for the panel, I think the most important question is, how can we make sure we understand our own biases? Right? I think we all have biases, and we are so ashamed of our biases that we don't want to go there, and then those questions become really, really hard to deal with. So that would be one important question to ask, I feel. Does that resonate with you when you deal with these situations? That's so more a question than an answer.
Well, I mean, ultimately, that's where the humility comes in, right? Is really understanding, our own flaws and our own prejudices, and really owning that. That is, but again, this is the paradox. It's that it's in the vulnerability where there's strength. There's in the honesty about who we are, that there's wisdom and compassion. So it's the exact opposite of what we learn in our society now, because it's all about being strong and being No, it's about the soft belly. It is, and really owning. I feel much safer with somebody who says to me, you know what, I'm really prejudiced, or you know what, I feel murderous right now, or you know what, because we all do, but we just don't own it. And it's in the owning of it, I think, that we feel safer, and then we can, as we said before, then we can heal.
One of the things that's the most offensive to me, a microaggression, is when someone says to me that they're colorblind. And, I question, how do they drive? But more than that, it's a lie. Because if you tell me you're colorblind, then you don't see who I am. I love being a black man. I love this. I make no excuses. I have been through difficult things that some could not get through. I love being a black man. I know I have biases. I have biases against black people. I have biases against white people. I have biases against Jews, but I have biases for Jews. I have biases for black people. I have biases for white people. I have biases against Islamic. I have biases for. It is how do I live my everyday life recognizing these impulses come to me? How do I get through this maze of feelings? And I can only do it if I have custody of my ego, if I know my true self, if I recognize that there's something within others that is beautiful and wonderful, regardless of whether or not I agree with how they think. I am the deacon at in St. Mary's in Simsbury, Connecticut. It is so white people call him white. And there are people who are on the far right of the Republican Party, and I'm not. And yet I am their clergy. And we can get back and get through anything because we have a commonality in terms of what we believe in. And that's where we go. It is finding that one place where we are brothers and sisters.
I want to say something else. Because you inspire me. I gotta speak up.
That's because we've known each other
Yeah,
so long.
that's right. There's I think it's about complexity. I think part of this is about complexity, that we're all lots of different things, and we sometimes want to cut ourselves off from some parts of what we are. And there's a really wonderful approach to psychotherapy. It's called internal family systems, and it talks about parts. We all have these different parts, and they can be in conflict with one another. It's almost like we're a microcosm of the conflict that's outside, right? So we can have a jealous part and a very sweet part and a murderous part. So the guy who developed the system, his name is Richard Schwartz, he says this really, really smart thing. I think about it all the time. He says, you want to get to the place where you speak for the parts, not from the parts. So as soon as you say, I'm prejudiced, against Jews, huh? And you said that.
I also said prejudiced for
I know, I felt that. As soon as you say it, you're speaking from the part, from the part, not for the part. As soon as you own it, as soon as you say I feel murderous, as soon as you say I'm racist, that's why it's safer, because you're not acting it out, you're owning it. And that is, I think, a huge contribution to civility.
Well, I'm going to end with this one, at least from my point of view. I need to sit down with you all and learn about this whole bias thing. I really do. I guess the definition escapes me, and I didn't want to be disrespectful and pull out my phone and actually look up the definition, because I'm being honest. I don't feel that I understand it enough, and I'm being real. Because I don't look at anyone in this room and feel like I'm more than anyone in here, or that I'm less than anyone in here. So perhaps I just don't know the definition of the word bias, but I'm willing to learn it.
So I guess I'm being asked to wrap us up for the evening. What an outstanding panel, and just an incredible conversation, one that I have enjoyed listening to and being a part of. And so thank you to our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you to Richard for inviting me to be a part of this, Brandon for being a great co-moderator, and thank you to the Harry Beecher Stowe House for having us out here to do this event and just do something really powerful. And I'm sure we're going to all walk away from this having learned quite a bit and having a lot to think about as well. So thank you once again.